In the winter of 1923, a German homemaker left her apartment with a wheelbarrow. It was not for groceries or firewood, but for a single loaf of bread. The wheelbarrow was filled to the brim with banknotes, each denomination greater than the last. A single loaf, by midday, might cost 5 billion marks. By evening, it could be 10 billion. The currency, once a symbol of the nation's might, had become a paper joke, fueling fireplaces instead of commerce. This wasn't an isolated incident, a mere anomaly in economic history. It was a recurring symptom, a predictable fever in the life cycle of great powers. Empires, it turns out, do not collapse from sudden, unforeseen external shocks alone. Their demise is often seeded internally, in the very foundation of their economic strength, their currency. A pattern emerges across millennia, a repeating cycle of sound money, debt-funded expansion, debasement, and ultimately, the loss of confidence that precedes the fall. By understanding these repeating mechanisms, we begin to read the warning signs before they are etched into the history books. ###9. The assignats of revolutionary France, 1789 to 1797. Our journey begins not with the clatter of a printing press, but with the fervent promises of revolution. Following the storming of the Bastille in 1789, France found itself not only politically remade but also deeply in debt. The solution, proposed by the revolutionary government, was the *assignat star. Initially, these paper notes were backed by confiscated church lands, intended as a temporary measure to bridge the financial gap. However, the temptation of easy money proved irresistible. As the revolution intensified and war loomed, the presses ran faster. By 1792, the value of the assignat had depreciated significantly, with a 100-livre assignat being worth barely 60 metal livres. The government, needing funds for its armies and social programs, continued to print. The perceived backing in land became increasingly irrelevant as the sheer volume of paper overwhelmed any real-world value. By 1797, a law of prairial was enacted, declaring that all contracts must be settled in specie metal coins, effectively acknowledging the total failure of the assignats. They had depreciated to less than 1% of their face value. The lesson here is simple: even revolutionary fervor cannot defy the laws of supply and demand when it comes to money. Confidence, once lost, rarely returns. ###8. The Confederate dollar, 1861 to 1865. Across the Atlantic, during the American Civil War, another government facing immense pressure succumbed to the same temptation. The Confederate States of America, a new entity lacking an established tax base or a strong industrial economy, turned to printing unbacked paper currency to finance its war effort. Initially, patriotism and the belief in a quick victory sustained some faith in the Confederate dollar. But as the war dragged on and battlefield losses mounted, the government's ability to redeem its promises dwindled. The Confederate government issued over $1.5 billion in paper currency. By the war's end in 1865, a pair of boots could cost a soldier $500, and a cup of coffee might be $100. The currency had become virtually worthless, traded at a fraction of a cent on the dollar in gold. This wasn't just a wartime measure, it was a desperate gamble that failed, illustrating how a government's inability to collect taxes or raise sufficient revenue leads inevitably to the printing press and the subsequent destruction of purchasing power. The cost of war, when not borne by taxation or genuine borrowing, is always paid by the value of money itself. ###7. The Roman denarius, 2nd to 3rd century AD. To truly grasp the repeating nature of these cycles, we must look further back, beyond paper and printing presses, to the very origins of coinage. The Roman denarius, for centuries, was a benchmark of stable currency. Initially, it was a silver coin, containing over 4 grams of pure silver. The empire, however, was a vast, sprawling entity, with legions to pay and ever-growing administrative costs. Emperors, under increasing financial strain, discovered a seemingly simple solution: debasement. Nero, in 64 AD, reduced the silver content of the denarius from 90% to 80%. Subsequent emperors continued this gradual erosion. By the time of Septimius Severus at the turn of the 3rd century, the silver content was down to about 50%. Caracalla, his son, introduced the Antoninianus, supposedly worth 2 denarii but containing only 1.5 times the silver. This trend accelerated dramatically during the crisis of the 3rd century. By the reign of Gallienus, 253 to 268 AD, the denarius was barely 5% silver, mostly copper with a thin silver wash. The visible result was inflation, a general distrust in imperial money, and a retreat to bartering or hoarding older, purer coins. The Roman Empire did not fall in a day, but the denarius, stripped of its metallic integrity, was an early casualty, illustrating how even a metal-backed currency can be destroyed by government-sanctioned dilution. ###6. The Spanish Maravidi, 17th century. From the golden age of exploration to the slow decline, Spain offers another poignant example. The Spanish Empire, flush with silver from its New World colonies, was paradoxically prone to monetary instability. While vast quantities of silver flowed into Seville, the crown's expenditures, particularly on wars in Europe, consistently outstripped even this immense wealth. The solution, at times, was not just to spend the silver, but to dilute its value. The *vellon coinage, particularly the *Maravidi*, which was largely copper, was periodically reminted with less and less metal. The government would repeatedly declare a higher nominal value for these debased coins, effectively trying to mandate their purchasing power. For example, in 1603, the value of the vellon was suddenly doubled by royal decree. Merchants, however, were not fooled. They raised prices commensurately, or simply refused to accept the debased currency at its proclaimed value. This led to chronic inflation, economic disruption, and a loss of confidence in the monarchy's fiscal management. The plentiful silver from the Americas paradoxically masked and exacerbated the underlying fiscal irresponsibility, proving that even a flood of precious metals cannot save a currency from the pressures of uncontrolled government spending and manipulation. ###5. The Chinese flying money, Song dynasty, 11th century. Long before Europe widely adopted paper money, China, under the Song dynasty, pioneered its use. Initially, it was a convenience, designed to avoid transporting heavy metal coins over long distances. Known as *jiaozi* or flying money, these notes were receipts for deposits of metal coin or other goods, issued by merchants and later by the government. The concept was brilliant, the promise to pay, backed by real assets. However, the temptation to print beyond the reserves proved too strong, especially during times of war or economic strain. The Northern Song dynasty, for example, issued vast quantities of *wheezy*, another form of paper money, during its conflicts with the Jurchens. By the 1160s, the government was issuing notes with redemption periods of 20 to 30 years, rather than instant convertibility. The inevitable result was depreciation and widespread loss of trust. The Southern Song dynasty tried to restore order but eventually succumbed to the same pressures, issuing ever more notes without adequate backing. This early experience in China laid bare a fundamental truth: paper money's value rests entirely on the issuing authority's discipline and perceived ability to honor its promises. Once that promise is broken, even the most innovative currency system crumbles. ###4. The Continental Dollar, 1775 to 1781. The birth of the United States was a struggle not only on battlefields but also in the realm of finance. The newly formed Continental Congress, lacking the power to tax its citizens or compel states to contribute revenue, resorted to printing paper money, the Continental Dollar, to fund the Revolutionary War. There was no gold or silver backing, merely the promise of a future nation. Initially accepted with patriotic fervor, the Continental's value began to erode as the war dragged on and the quantity of notes in circulation swelled. By 1779, it took 100 Continental dollars to buy what could be bought with a single silver dollar. The phrase "not worth a Continental" entered the American lexicon as a byword for utter worthlessness. Merchants demanded specie, soldiers faced starvation, and the nascent government struggled to procure supplies. The collapse of the Continental Dollar highlighted how an unbacked currency, especially in a time of existential crisis and without a clear plan for redemption, inevitably loses public trust and economic utility. It was a stark lesson for the young republic, forcing a later adoption of a more stable monetary system under the Constitution. Which empire do you think we are most like right now? Tell me below. 3. The Austrian krone, post-World War I, 1919 to 1925. After the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire following World War I, the newly formed Republic of Austria inherited a shattered economy and a crippling war debt. The Austro-Hungarian krone, already weakened by wartime inflation, became the national currency. Like so many others, the Austrian government, facing immense reparations, social unrest, and a decimated industrial base, turned to the printing press as its primary means of financing. The results were predictable and catastrophic. From 1919 to 1922, prices in Austria soared, leading to a period of intense hyperinflation. The cost of living index rose from 100 in 1914 to over 14,000 in 1921, and then to 120,000 by mid-1922. The krona rapidly lost its value, with exchange rates against the dollar plummeting from around 100 kronas to $1 in 1919 to over 70,000 kronas to $1 by 1922. People rushed to convert their rapidly depreciating paper into anything tangible, goods, foreign currency, or even barter. The situation only stabilized with the intervention of the League of Nations and the introduction of a new currency, the shilling, in 1925, backed by a loan and fiscal reforms. Austria's experience serves as a clear precursor to the German hyperinflation, demonstrating how the post-war financial burden, coupled with a lack of economic discipline, can utterly destroy a nation's currency. 2. The Hungarian Pengő, post-World War II, 1945 to 1946. If the German mark's collapse was a crisis, the Hungarian Pengő's demise was an economic apocalypse. Emerging from the devastation of World War II, Hungary faced the monumental task of rebuilding while contending with Soviet occupation and crippling reparations. The government's response to these overwhelming fiscal demands was an unprecedented scale of money printing. The Pengő's hyperinflation is widely considered the worst in recorded history. The daily inflation rate reached an astonishing 207% in July 1946, meaning prices doubled every 15 hours. A 100 quintillion Pengő banknote was issued, yet even this astronomical denomination was virtually worthless. People were paid by the hour and rushed to spend their earnings before they lost all value. A stamp for a letter might cost more than a month's wages just hours later. Eventually, the currency was replaced by the forint, with a staggering exchange rate of 1 forint to 400 octillion, for times 10 to the power of 29, Pengő. The Hungarian Pengő's fate serves as a chilling testament to the absolute destruction that unfettered money printing can wreak upon an economy and the daily lives of its citizens. It is a stark reminder that printing money is not wealth creation, it is merely a redistribution, often one that devastates the most vulnerable. 1. The German mark, Weimar Republic, 1923. The most infamous example of government-induced currency collapse, and perhaps the most illustrative, is that of the German mark during the Weimar Republic. Following World War I, Germany was burdened with enormous war reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The German government, unable or unwilling to raise sufficient revenue through taxation, financed its budget deficits and reparations payments by printing vast quantities of money. Initially, this printing was a slow drip, but by 1922, it became a torrent. The occupation of the Ruhr by French and Belgian troops in January 1923, in response to Germany's failure to pay reparations, exacerbated the crisis. The German government called for passive resistance from its workers, promising to pay them even while they refused to work. This policy further fueled the printing presses. By November 1923, the exchange rate of the German mark against the US dollar had plummeted from 4.2 marks to $1 in 1914, to an astronomical 4.2 trillion marks to $1. The consequences for ordinary Germans were devastating. Savings were wiped out overnight. Wages were paid daily, sometimes twice daily, requiring employees to rush to stores before prices rose again. People used banknotes as wallpaper or fuel, as they were cheaper than actual paper or wood. This wasn't merely an economic event, it shattered the social fabric, eroded trust in institutions, and created fertile ground for political extremism. The introduction of the Rentenmark, a new currency backed by a mortgage on all industrial and agricultural land, finally stabilized the situation. The German mark's collapse is a definitive illustration of how government mismanagement, particularly in the face of debt and external pressure, can lead to a complete and utter destruction of currency value, undermining the very stability of a nation. Every empire, every nation facing these pressures, believed it was the exception. They believed their unique circumstances, their inherent strength, or their innovative policies would allow them to defy the monetary gravity that brought down others. This belief, however, is precisely the symptom. It is the narrative that accompanies the very mechanisms that lead to collapse, the promise that more printing, more debt, more debasement, will somehow solve a problem caused by those exact actions. The warning signs are not in abstract economic models, but in the relentless erosion of purchasing power, the accelerating growth of debt relative to productivity, and the increasing reliance on the printing press to fund the unpayable. The currency dies before the empire does. Subscribe to see the warning signs before they make the history books.